So I have an interesting question for all of you. When you read comics, do you imagine voice actors to the words you're reading? I know some people who do that. I really do know some people. Some of my friends do that. Like they do have that thought in their head. They do have that like when you're reading the words, like you have a voice to associate with that comic character, and it could be anyone. So that's the question. The question we're going to be asking for this video. I'm going to talk about the characters and the voices I imagine for each character. Some of these might be predictable. Some of these might be, oh, okay, that's one. That's a voice. So of course we're starting off first and foremost with Batman. Who is my Batman? It's Kevin Conroy. It's not even like rip. Kevin Conroy is Batman. Like that's the voice of Batman I imagine every time I read a Batman book. Whenever it is a Batman book, whether it be a TAS adaptation comic or whatever, it is usually a Kevin Conroy voice for Batman. Although there is some times where I'm like, some of the more ridiculous, when I read a ridiculous comic, I like to imagine Troy Baker doing his Lego Batman voice, which is just his Batman voice, but he can make ridiculous serious sounding ridiculous Batman sound fun. So I do like that. So yeah, there is that sometimes, but let's be real, it's Kevin Conroy every fucking time for Batman. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Anyway, so following that, as for another character, let's move on to Superman. Who's my Superman voice? This is a big one. Like, this is always like a debated one because there are several there's several actors and voice actors that people like to say, that's my Superman, or that's my voice of Superman. And when it always comes to like voice of Superman, there's usually two that come up. There's really two that come up the most: George Newbern or Tim Daly. Those are your two. Obviously, Tim Daly from the Superman animated series, and George Newbern from Justice League Unlimited, and did Injustice Superman, as well as several other voices here and there. Hot take, but George Newbern. That's who I imagine for my Superman voice when I'm reading a Superman comic, is George Newbern. I like, no disrespect to Tim Daly. No disrespect to Tim Daly. I just like George Newbern's voice because he has this level of just heroic to him, as well as like it's a Superman who's seen a lot and done a lot. Like there's like an air of wisdom to his Superman, if that makes any sense. Like there's like this era of calm demeanor to his voice, and that's what I kind of like to think of when I read Superman. I especially like imagining George Newbern's voice when I read like Kingdom Come Superman, or like an older Superman, especially like I did when I did my previous review on the previous video being book 2 of the Warworld saga. I just imagine George Newbern's voice when he's fighting Mongol, and he's just like, you're an idiot, you know, the arrogance that you think that these people are just maggots that you get to just step on when they're so much more. Like, yeah, that's the kind of dialogue I imagine for Superman. And I apologize for how nasally I sound. I'm just got a bug, and I'm just fighting through it. So, sorry about that. Anyway, so there you go. For Wonder Woman, I'm not going to do every character, by the way. I'm not going to do every single character, like, who do I imagine? For Wonder Woman, Susan Sarandon. Not Susan Sarandon, Susan Eisenberg, excuse me. Susan Sarandon. Although that wouldn't be bad. She wouldn't be a bad voice-wise, not live-action-wise. But Susan Eisenberg, who, of course, did Wonder Woman for DC Universe. So, yeah, Susan Eisenberg is my voice for Wonder Woman. So, there's the big three. Real quick for a few other characters, Tara Strong for Batgirl, Arlene Sorkin for Harley Quinn, And Mark Hamill for Joker. Come on. Like, of course, whenever you think of, like, who does the voice... Like, when you read a Joker comic, of course you're going to imagine Mark Hamill's voice, right? Right? Like, that's the thing. For a few other characters, I would say Jeffrey Combs whenever I read a Question comic. Because, again, he did the voice of the Question in... oh, shit. He did the voice of the Question in Justice League Unlimited. So, yeah. And he's also just kind of like, Jeffrey Combs is just kind of perfect as the Question. So there's that. There's also, I would say, Nathan Fillion for for Hal Jordan Green Lantern. Although I will say that David Boreanaz was a pretty good Green Lantern voice from New Frontier. So those are just a few. I'm not going to go through... I'm not going to do this, waste your time with naming every character, but there's a lot. So let's move on to Marvel real quick. Like, let's go on to the Marvel side of what characters I imagine for these characters. Like, who's the voice for these characters? Starting off with Spider-Man. So who's my Spider-Man voice? Whenever I read a Spider-Man comic, who is that Spider-Man? And, yeah, I think it really does depend on the comic. This one's interesting because it really does depend on the comic itself, because it depends on whether I'm reading a younger Spider-Man book and an older Spider-Man book. For a younger Spider-Man, it's Josh Keaton. Like, if I'm reading a younger Spider-Man, a comic where he's younger, it's Josh Keaton. He's just perfect as young Spider-Man. But if I'm reading, like, an older, like, adult Spider-Man and dealing with stuff like the like, if I'm reading, like... Okay, I especially listen to hear this voice when I'm reading dialogue from, like, the 80s era Spider-Man or, you know, the 90s era, 90s, early 2000s Spider-Man books. And that's, like, the Dave Michelinie, especially the Dave Michelinie era of Spider-Man. Yeah, it's Christopher Daniel Barnes, the voice of 90s cartoon Spider-Man, who I think is really awesome. So it really does depend. It's either Keaton or Daniel Barnes. One of those two show up in my head. For Wolverine, come on, guys, come on, you know who it is. It's Carl Dodd. Carl Dodd is... Whenever I'm reading a Wolverine comic, it's Carl Dodd's voice I hear in my head. That's kind of the big thing, is that it's really Carl Dodd's voice I hear in my head when I'm reading a Spider-Man, when I'm reading a Wolverine book, or whenever Wolverine shows up. Really, honestly, it's the entire, like, let's get into it real quick. It is the entire 90s cast of X-Men like, the entire 90s, whenever I'm reading an X-Men comic, and I see, like, Beast, or Xavier, or Magneto, or Cyclops, or Jean, or Gambit, or Jubilee, or Rogue. It's the fucking 90s cast. It was perfect. It was, like, to quote Homelander, it was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Right down to the smallest detail, perfect. Like, that's the best, like, it was the best voice cast, and I just imagine all of those voices whenever I'm reading those characters in a Marvel comic. As for other characters, I would say, although I will, Mr. Sinister, I will say that, like, because of how they've made him in the Krakoan era of X-Men, I will say that his voice has kind of changed a bit, and I kind of imagine Steve Blum doing the voice of Mr. Sinister, because he's just such a catty bitch now. It's almost like he's Transformers Prime Starscream. So, yeah, I really do. Also, I do think Steve Blum would be a really cool... Steve Blum would make a really cool voice for Mr. Sinister. I also say that Blum is also my voice for Green Goblin. Not Norman Osborn, Green Goblin. Different voices. As for Dr. Octopus, like Alfred Molina, who played him in live action, Yeah, there's a lot of characters. I kind of imagine. Again, there's a lot of others. Another one, real quick, in the independent line, I will say that Ron Perlman is the voice I hear whenever I read a Hellboy book, because he was so damn perfect. So yeah, obviously, fucking Ron Perlman is my voice for Hellboy. Whenever I'm reading a Hellboy book, it's Ron Perlman's voice I hear, and yeah, his just delivery and is just perfect for the dialogue. That's really like the big names right there. That's really the big names. And I know this is such an off the wall question. This is like such a bizarre question, but like it's a fun one too, because I've seen so many people talk about like, oh, whenever I read a comic, I imagine this person's voice reading the dialogue and it helps me read. So I'm obviously not the only one. So let me ask, so I'm going to put the ball in your court, everyone out there on YouTube. What voices do you hear when you're reading comics? Like, what voice actor or actor in general do you hear when you're reading comic book dialogue? Like, what's the voice? Just comment below, let me know. Once again, hope you all enjoyed this. If you haven't already, hit the link below, head on over to my Patreon. I just did a new episode on Requalizers with my good friend Ace, as well as Steven Shinder. That was really cool. We talked about My Bloody Valentine, so hit the link below, head on over to my Patreon. Other than that, hope you all enjoyed this. I'm Mr. Multiverse. I'll see you next time in the Multiverse.